Hey, quick question before we even start. Have you ever watched a movie in English, felt totally fine reading the subtitles, and then turned the subtitles off just to see what happens? And suddenly, it felt like the actors switched to a completely different language? Like they were speaking English, but not the English you learned in your textbook? Yeah, that happened to me too. And if that's you right now, stay with me for the next few minutes, because today we're going to fix that, step by step, together. Welcome back to English in Fluency, the show where we don't just study English, we actually learn how real people use it, in real conversations, at real speed, with all the mess and beauty that comes with that. I'm Alex, and I'm genuinely glad you're here today, because this episode is for a very specific kind of listener. Maybe that's you. You've studied grammar for years. You know your tenses. You can read an article and understand almost everything. But then a native speaker opens their mouth in a fast, casual conversation, and your brain just freezes. Words blur together. Sentences fly past you, and by the time you understand one sentence, they're already 3 sentences ahead. Sound familiar? Don't worry. This is one of the most common experiences for learners at the B1 level, and honestly, even some higher-level learners struggle with this too. Today, we're going to talk about exactly why this happens, and more importantly, what you can actually do about it. Starting today, not someday, today. Before we go further, let me tell you why I care so much about this specific topic. A few years ago, I had a good friend named Marco. Marco moved from Italy to an English-speaking country, and before he arrived, he was seriously confident about his English. He'd studied it in school for years. He passed exams. He could write emails. He could read novels. He thought, listening will be easy. I already understand English. Then he landed, and on his very first day, he went to a small coffee shop to order a coffee. The barista, a friendly guy, looked at him and said something like, "What ya doing today? Want to try the new blend? Or you stickin' with the usual?" And Marco just stood there, completely lost. Not because he didn't know the words what, you, doing, want, to, try, or usual. He knew every single one of those words. He just couldn't recognize them the way they were actually spoken, all squeezed together, fast, with sounds dropped and blended. That moment stuck with him, and honestly, it stuck with me too, because it's such a perfect example of the gap between textbook English and real spoken English. And that gap is exactly what we're closing today. So here's the first big idea I want you to really absorb, and I want you to actually let this sink in, not just nod along. Understanding native speakers is not really about knowing more words. It's about training your ears to recognize the words you already know when they're spoken naturally, quickly, and connected together. That's a completely different skill from reading. When you read, every word is separated by a space, nice and clean. But when people speak, especially in casual, everyday conversation, words blend into each other, sounds disappear, and whole phrases get shortened into something that barely resembles the original words on paper. This is called connected speech, and once you understand how it works, listening becomes so much less scary, I promise you. Let's break this down together with some real, practical examples, because I don't want this episode to be just theory. I want you to actually hear the difference in your mind as we go through this. Take the phrase, "What are you doing?" In a textbook, that's 4 clear words. But in real, fast, casual speech, native speakers often say something closer to "what you doing?" or even "what you doin'?" The "what are you?" gets squeezed into something that sounds almost like one single word. Or take "I am going to go to the store." Nobody, and I mean almost nobody, says that in relaxed conversation. Instead, you'll hear "I'm gonna go to the store." And honestly, sometimes even faster, it becomes "Imma go to the store." Another one, "Do you want to eat?" This regularly becomes "You wanna eat?" or just "wanna eat?" And here's a fun one that trips up a lot of learners. "What did you do?" often turns into "what you do?" or "what'd you do?" Now, I know what some of you might be thinking right now. "Alex, this sounds like slang. This sounds lazy. Is this even correct English?" And that's such a fair question, so let's clear it up completely. This isn't laziness, and it isn't incorrect. This is simply how humans speak when they're relaxed, comfortable, and moving quickly through a conversation. In basically every language on this planet, not just English. Think about your own native language for a second. Do you pronounce every single word perfectly and separately when you're chatting casually with a close friend? Almost certainly not. You blend sounds together too. You drop syllables. You speed up. Every language has this pattern. English is just no exception. And honestly, English has quite a lot of it because of how many small function words like to, a, the, is, and are show up constantly in every sentence. And those little words are exactly the ones that get squeezed, shortened, and swallowed in fast speech. So now that we understand why this happens, let's talk about the actual mechanics of connected speech. Because once you know the patterns, your brain starts recognizing them automatically. Almost like learning to see a hidden picture once someone points it out to you. There are a few common patterns I want to walk you through today. The first one is called linking, where the final sound of one word connects smoothly into the beginning sound of the next word. For example, "turn it off" doesn't sound like three separate words. It sounds more like "turn it off," flowing together as one smooth unit, almost like "turn it off." Or an apple becomes an apple, with the N sound linking right into the A of apple. Try saying "not at all" slowly, then say it quickly, and notice how it starts to sound like "not at all." That's linking in action. The second pattern is reduction, and this is honestly one of the biggest reasons B1 learners struggle with listening. Reduction means certain sounds, especially in small, unstressed words, get weaker, shorter, or disappear almost completely. The word to often reduces to sound like to. The word for often reduces to fur. Them often becomes m, as in give 'em to me, instead of give them to me. Even the word and frequently shrinks down to just n, like in fish and chips or rock and roll. When you're reading a script, you see the full word and. When you're listening to real speech, your ears might only catch that tiny little N sound, and if you don't know to expect that, it can feel like the word just vanished into thin air. The third pattern, and this one is honestly a personal favorite of mine because it explains so much confusion, is called assimilation. This is when one sound changes because of the sound right next to it, almost like two sounds blending together into something new. A classic example is "don't you," which very often becomes "don'tcha," or "did you," which becomes "didja," or "won't you," which becomes "won'tcha." Notice the pattern here. The T sound and the Y sound are literally melting together into a ch sound. Once you start noticing this pattern, You'll begin hearing it absolutely everywhere, in movies, in podcasts, in real conversations with your coworkers or classmates, and it stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling familiar, almost comfortable. Let me bring this back to a story, because I think stories help this stick better than just rules and examples alone. Remember Marco from the coffee shop? Well, after that first embarrassing morning, Marco didn't give up. And honestly, that's the part of his story I admire the most. He got curious instead of discouraged. He started really paying attention to how people actually spoke around him, not how they wrote, not how his textbook wrote dialogue, but how actual humans, in real moments, used their mouths and their breath to communicate quickly and casually. He started noticing that his co-worker, a warm, funny woman named Priya, would say things like, "Let me know," instead of "let me know," or "gonna grab some lunch, you in?" instead of the fully spelled-out version. At first, this felt overwhelming to him, like there was a secret second language hiding inside English that nobody had warned him about. But slowly, over weeks, something shifted. His ears started adjusting. The blended sounds started sounding less like mysterious noise and more like familiar shortcuts, patterns he could predict. And that word, predict, is honestly the key to everything we're talking about today. Good listening, especially at the B1 level and moving toward B2, is not passive. It's not just sitting there letting sound wash over you and hoping you catch enough words to piece together meaning. Good listening is active and predictive. Your brain, when it's trained well, starts anticipating what's likely to come next based on context, grammar patterns, and common phrases, and it fills in small gaps automatically, the same way your brain fills in a word you didn't fully hear in your own native language, because you're using context to support what your ears missed. This is a skill, and like any skill, it improves specifically through practice. The right kind of practice, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But first, let's talk about one more piece of the puzzle, because pronunciation and connected speech are only half of the listening challenge. The other half is speed and rhythm. English is what's called a stress-timed language. That means certain words in a sentence, usually the important content words like nouns, main verbs, adjectives, and negative words, get stressed, spoken slightly louder, slightly longer, slightly clearer. Meanwhile, the small function words like a, the, is, to, of, get compressed into the gaps between those stressed words, almost squeezed to fit the rhythm. This creates a kind of musical, up and down rhythm in English speech, where the timing between stressed syllables stays fairly even, no matter how many small words are crammed in between them. Some languages are syllable-timed instead, meaning every syllable gets roughly equal time and equal weight, which creates a very different rhythm. If your native language is syllable-timed, English rhythm can genuinely feel strange and unpredictable at first, almost bumpy, and that's completely normal and expected, not a sign that something is wrong with you or your learning. So here's a practical exercise you can try literally right after this episode, and I want you to actually try this, not just listen and move on. Pick a short sentence, maybe 8 to 10 words long, from a show or podcast you enjoy. Something simple, casual, conversational. Listen to it slowly, maybe 5 or 6 times in a row, focusing only on which words feel stressed, longer and clearer, versus which words feel squeezed and quiet. Then try saying the sentence yourself, exaggerating that same rhythm, stressing the same words the speaker stressed, and rushing through the same small words they rushed through. This is sometimes called shadowing, and it's genuinely one of the most powerful tools for training your ear because it forces you to physically produce the rhythm, not just passively hear it. And there's strong evidence that speak in a rhythm helps your brain recognize that same rhythm much faster when you hear it again later. Let's go back to Marco's story for a bit longer, because his journey really shows how this practice pays off over time. About 2 months after that coffee shop moment, Marco started doing something every single morning before work. He'd pick a short clip, sometimes from a podcast, sometimes from a show he liked. Just 30 seconds or so, nothing huge, nothing overwhelming. He'd listen to it once normally, just to get the general idea. Then he'd listen again, this time pausing every few seconds to repeat exactly what he heard, copying the rhythm, copying the melody, even copying little breaths and pauses. At first, it felt clumsy, even a little silly, like he was performing in an empty room. But he kept going because he noticed something interesting. Even in the first week, real conversations at work started feeling just slightly less overwhelming. Not perfect, not magically fluent, but slightly less like a wall of noise, and slightly more like actual words he could grab onto. By month 3, something bigger happened. Priya invited him to a small team lunch, and during that lunch, a coworker named Ben told a fairly long, casual story about a weekend camping trip that went wrong, full of fast talking, laughter, interruptions, slang, the whole real, messy texture of natural conversation. And Marco realized, somewhere in the middle of that story, that he was actually following along. Not catching 100% of every word. Nobody catches 100%. Even native speakers miss words sometimes. But he was catching the shape of the story, the emotions, the key moments, enough to laugh at the right parts, enough to ask a follow-up question that actually made sense. That moment, for him, felt like a genuine turning point. And he told me later that it wasn't some giant dramatic breakthrough, it was just quiet confidence, slowly building, day after day, practice after practice. I share Marco's story because I think it's really important for you to hear that this transformation is not instant, and it's not magic. And honestly, anyone who tells you there's a secret trick to suddenly understand native speakers overnight is probably trying to sell you something. Real listening improvement comes from consistent, focused, somewhat playful practice, done regularly, ideally daily, even if it's just for 10 or 15 minutes. Little and often beats occasional and long every single time, in language learning generally, and especially in listening. Now let's get really practical, because I promised you this episode would give you tools you can use immediately, not just interesting ideas to think about. Here's a listening practice method I want to walk you through, and I'll explain it step by step, almost like we're doing it together right now. Choose a short audio clip, somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes long, something with natural conversational English, a podcast excerpt, a scene from a show, even a short clip from an interview. The key is that it should sound casual and real, not scripted news anchor style speech, because news anchors actually speak more clearly and slowly than everyday conversation, which is helpful for beginners, but won't fully prepare you for casual talk. First, listen once, all the way through, without pausing, without reading a transcript, and just try to catch the general topic and mood. Don't panic if you miss a lot. That's expected and completely fine at this stage. Second, listen again. And this time, pause every time you feel lost or confused. When you pause, ask yourself a simple question. What do I think they just said? Try to guess, even if you're not confident, based on the sounds you caught and the context around them. This step is honestly one of the most valuable parts of the whole exercise, because guessing, actively trying to fill gaps, trains your brain's predictive listening muscles far more than passively re-listening ever could. Third, check a transcript, if one's available, or replay that section slowly, if your app allows slow playback. Compare what was actually said to what you guessed. Notice specifically where the difference is. Was there a linking sound you didn't expect? A reduced word you didn't recognize? An idiom or phrasal verb you'd never heard before? This step turns confusion into concrete, specific learning, instead of vague frustration. Fourth, and this is the step most learners skip, but please don't skip it. Go back and shadow that same short section. Play it, pause it, repeat it out loud, copying the rhythm, the linking, the reductions, as closely as you can. Do this for the tricky section maybe 5 or 6 times. I know that might sound repetitive, maybe even a little boring, but this repetition is exactly what rewires your ear and your mouth together, creating a stronger, faster connection between hearing a pattern and recognizing it instantly next time. Fifth, and finally, come back to that same clip a day or two later and listen to it fresh, from the beginning, without pausing. You'll likely notice, and this part genuinely feels rewarding, that it sounds clearer now, easier, more familiar, almost like the audio itself slowed down, even though, obviously, it didn't. Your brain adjusted, not the recording. Let's take a short pause from the method itself and talk about something equally important: mindset. Because honestly, your emotional relationship with listening practice matters just as much as the technique. A huge number of learners at the B1 level feel embarrassed or frustrated when they don't understand native speakers. And that frustration, understandably, sometimes leads people to avoid real listening practice altogether. They stick to slow, clear textbook audio because it feels safe and comfortable. And while that's genuinely useful for building foundations, staying only in that comfortable zone forever means you never build the specific skill of understanding fast, messy, real conversation. Growth, in listening just like in almost everything else, happens specifically at the edge of your comfort zone, not deep inside it, and definitely not miles outside it either. I want you to think about listening practice a bit like physical exercise, because the comparison genuinely holds up well. If you only ever lift very light weights, you'll feel comfortable, but you won't build much strength. If you try to lift something absurdly heavy on day one, you'll likely get hurt or discouraged and quit. The sweet spot is choosing something slightly challenging, something that pushes you just a bit past comfortable, consistently, over time. For listening, that might mean choosing audio that's maybe 70 to 80% understandable to you right now, not completely easy, but not completely overwhelming either. As that 70 to 80% creeps up toward 90, 95%, you move to slightly more challenging material, and the cycle continues, gradually, steadily, without ever feeling impossibly hard. Let's return to our story world for a moment, because I want to introduce someone else, A listener I'll call Sophia. Based on messages and comments many of you have sent me over time about your own listening struggles, sort of a combined character representing thousands of real experiences. Sophia studied English for 6 years in school. She could read fairly advanced articles. She understood grammar rules better than most native speakers even do, honestly. And she wrote beautifully in English. But conversations, especially on the phone, terrified her. Phone calls remove all the visual clues. No lips to read, no gestures, no facial expressions, just pure sound. And for many learners, that's genuinely one of the hardest listening contexts there is. Sophia avoided phone calls in English for years, always making excuses, always asking friends to handle calls for her. One day, Sophia had no choice. She needed to call a customer service line about a delivery issue, and nobody else could help her that day. She was nervous. Her heart was racing, but she remembered something she'd read about connected speech and reduced forms, and she reminded herself, right before dialing, I don't need to understand every word. I need to catch the key words and use context. The representative on the phone spoke fairly quickly, using phrases like, "Let me check that for you," and "That'll be sent out shortly, Kay." Sophia caught maybe 70% of it clearly, but crucially, she caught enough. She understood the key information when her package would arrive, what she needed to do next, and she even managed to ask a clarifying question when something felt unclear. She hung up the phone and just sat there for a second, honestly kind of stunned. She'd done it. Not perfectly, but successfully. And successfully is really what matters in real communication, not perfection. This story matters because it highlights something crucial about B1 level listening specifically. At B1, your goal isn't complete, flawless comprehension of every single word in fast native speech. That's actually a higher level skill, something that develops more fully around B2 and C1. At B1, your realistic, healthy goal is functional comprehension, catching enough key information, enough important words, enough context clues to understand the overall message and respond appropriately. Chasing perfect comprehension too early often leads to unnecessary frustration and a feeling of constant failure, when really you're just not there yet developmentally, and that's completely fine and expected. Let's talk now about specific everyday phrases and reduced forms that show up constantly in native speech, because building familiarity with these specific patterns genuinely accelerates your listening comprehension quickly. I'm going to walk through several of these slowly, explain what they really mean, and give you a little context for each one, almost like we're collecting them together into your own personal listening toolkit. First, I don't know, which simply means, I don't know, said quickly and casually, often with a shrug in real life. Second, gonna, meaning going to, used constantly in casual speech, as in, I'm gonna call you later. Third, wanna, meaning want to, as in, do you want to come with us? Fourth, gotta, meaning got to or have to, as in, I gotta go now, sorry. Fifth, kinda, meaning kind of, often used to soften a statement, as in, I'm kinda tired today. Sixth, sorta, meaning sort of, used very similarly to kinda, as in, it's sorta complicated to explain. Let's continue this list a little further, because the more of these you recognize instantly, the smoother your listening becomes almost immediately. Lemme, meaning let me, as in, let me think about it for a second. Gimme, meaning give me, as in, gimme a minute, please. Outa, meaning out of, as in, we're out of milk again. 'Cause, meaning because, as in, I can't come 'cause I'm working late. Whatcha, meaning what are you, or what have you, depending on context, as in, what you doing this weekend. And finally, ain't, which is used informally, instead of isn't, aren't, or am not, as in, that ain't right. Though I'll mention gently that ain't is considered quite informal and isn't typically used in professional or formal writing, but you'll absolutely hear it in casual conversation, music, and film. So recognizing it matters even if you personally choose not to use it yourself in formal contexts. I want you to notice something about all of these phrases we just went through. None of them are secret slang words you'd need a special dictionary for. They're simply the natural, relaxed, spoken versions of words you almost certainly already know. Going to becomes gonna. Want to becomes wanna. That's it. That's genuinely the whole secret. Once your ears learn to automatically translate these reduced forms back into their full versions, without even consciously thinking about it, listening comprehension improves dramatically, because you stop getting stuck, confused, and left behind by these tiny, incredibly common shortcuts. Now, let's talk about a slightly different but closely related challenge: phrasal verbs and idioms, because native speakers use these constantly, almost without noticing, the same way they use reduced forms. A phrasal verb is a verb combined with one or two small words, like up, out, on, off, that together create a meaning that's often quite different from the individual words alone. For example, give up means to stop trying, which has nothing obviously to do with the literal meanings of give or up separately. Look forward to means to feel excited about something coming in the future. Run into means to meet someone unexpectedly. Put off means to delay or postpone something. Figure out means to understand or solve something after some thought. These phrases appear constantly in nearly every casual conversation, and if you're translating word by word in your head, they simply won't make sense, because the meaning lives in the whole phrase, not the individual pieces. Here's a genuinely practical tip for handling phrasal verbs in listening specifically. Rather than trying to memorize hundreds of phrasal verbs from a giant list, which honestly tends not to work very well for most learners, focus on learning them in small, natural groups, connected to specific situations or topics. For example, if you're learning phrasal verbs related to relationships, you might learn break up, meaning to end a romantic relationship, make up, meaning to reconcile after an argument, and hang out, meaning to spend casual time together. When you learn them together, connected by theme, your brain builds stronger, more memorable connections, and when you hear one of them in conversation, it becomes much easier to recall its meaning quickly, almost automatically, rather than searching through some huge disconnected mental list. Let's bring back Sophia's story for a moment, because her journey with phrasal verbs specifically taught her something valuable that I think will help you too. She used to genuinely panic whenever a phrasal verb appeared in a conversation, because she'd pause internally, trying to translate each small word separately. And by the time she'd finished that mental translation attempt, the conversation had already moved 3 sentences ahead without her. Her breakthrough came when she stopped trying to translate every phrasal verb in the moment and instead trained herself to notice the overall feeling and context around it. and simply let slightly unclear phrases go, trusting that the general meaning of the sentence would still come through from everything around it. She told me, honestly, that this single mindset shift, letting go of the need to understand every single piece perfectly, changed her listening experience more than almost any specific technique she tried. It reduced her anxiety, which, in turn, actually helped her catch more. Because anxiety itself tends to block comprehension, your brain has a much harder time processing new sounds when it's flooded with stress and self-criticism. This brings me to something I really want to emphasize clearly, because I think it's one of the most overlooked parts of listening skill development. Your emotional state directly affects your listening comprehension. This isn't just a nice, comforting idea. It's actually grounded in how our brains process language under stress. When you're anxious, tense, or afraid of failing, your brain devotes extra resources to managing that stress response, which leaves fewer resources available for the complex task of processing incoming sound, recognizing patterns, and predicting meaning. This is exactly why many learners report understanding native speakers better in relaxed, low-pressure situations. Watching a show alone on the couch, for example, compared to high-pressure situations, like a real-time conversation with a stranger where they feel judged or embarrassed. Knowing this, a genuinely helpful strategy is to practice listening specifically in low-pressure environments first, building comfort and confidence there, before gradually introducing more pressure, like real conversations, once your baseline comprehension feels stronger and steadier. Let's talk practically now about what kinds of listening material actually work best for B1 learners specifically, because not all English audio is created equal for your current level, and choosing wisely genuinely accelerates your progress. Podcasts designed specifically for English learners, like this very show, are excellent because the speed and vocabulary are usually adjusted thoughtfully to match your level, while still including natural features like some reductions, natural rhythm, and everyday vocabulary, without overwhelming you completely. Beyond learner-focused content, slower, clearly spoken native podcasts, interviews, or vlogs work well too, especially content where the speaker enunciates fairly clearly and doesn't speak in extremely fast bursts, like calm educational content or thoughtful interview shows. Shows with subtitles, in English, not your native language, are also incredibly valuable, because you can connect the sounds you're hearing directly to the words being said, gradually training your ear to recognize the connection between spoken sound and written word, which is honestly the whole foundation of listening skill. I want to gently caution you about one common mistake, though, because I see it constantly among learners, and I don't want you falling into the same trap. Watching content only with subtitles in your own native language, translated subtitles, might help you follow the plot of a movie, but it does very little to actually train your English listening skill, because your brain naturally relies on the translation instead of engaging with the English audio itself. If your goal is genuinely improving listening comprehension, and I'm guessing it is since you're here with me right now, prioritize English subtitles, or eventually no subtitles at all once you're ready, over translated subtitles in your native language. Let's talk about another really practical tool: slowing down audio speed using playback controls, which most podcast apps video platforms, and streaming services offer these days. If a piece of content feels genuinely too fast to follow at all, try slowing it down slightly, maybe to 85 or 90% speed. Listen a few times at that pace to build comprehension and confidence, and then gradually return to full, normal speed once the content feels more familiar and manageable. This technique bridges the gap between completely overwhelming and comfortably challenging, which, as we discussed earlier, is exactly the sweet spot where real learning happens most effectively. Now, I promised you earlier that we'd talk about a second, deeper turning point in Marco's story, and I think now is the right moment to share it, because it connects beautifully to everything we've just covered about mindset, practice, and gradually increasing challenge. About 6 months after that first coffee shop moment, Marco's company held a big team meeting, with people joining from several different countries, different accents, different speaking speeds, a genuinely challenging listening environment even for confident English speakers. Marco was asked, somewhat unexpectedly, to summarize part of the discussion for a colleague who'd joined the call late. In the old days, back at month 1, this would have been his worst nightmare. Pure panic. But this time, something different happened inside him. He noticed himself doing exactly what he'd practiced for months, catching key stressed words, using context to fill small gaps, staying calm instead of freezing up when he missed a word here or there, trusting the overall meaning to come through even when individual pieces felt unclear. He gave his colleague a clear, accurate, if imperfect, summary. And honestly, nobody in that meeting even noticed anything unusual because, to them, Marco simply sounded like someone confidently participating in a normal work conversation. But to Marco, internally, it felt like an enormous victory. Quiet, private, deeply meaningful. He told me later that this moment mattered more to him than any exam score or certificate he'd ever earned, because it was real, functional, lived proof that his daily practice, all those mornings of shadowing short audio clips, all those moments of choosing curiosity over frustration, had genuinely transformed how he experienced the English-speaking world around him. I share these stories, Marco's and Sophia's, not because they're perfect or extraordinary people with some special gift for languages, but specifically because they're not. They struggled, they felt embarrassed sometimes, they wanted to give up sometimes, and they succeeded anyway, gradually, through consistent, imperfect, very human effort. If you're listening to this episode right now feeling discouraged about your own listening skills, I genuinely want you to hear this clearly. Your current struggle is not a sign of failure or lack of talent. It's simply where you are right now in a process that every single successful English learner has gone through, including learners who are now completely fluent, comfortable, confident speakers. Let's shift now into a slightly more structured practice section, because I want to give you something concrete you can actually do, starting today, right after this episode ends. I'm going to walk you through a short listening challenge using patterns we've discussed, and I want you to genuinely try this, not just listen passively while I describe it. Think of a short, everyday scenario: ordering coffee, asking for directions, chatting with a coworker about weekend plans. Now, imagine, or better yet, actually find online, a short audio clip of native speakers having exactly that kind of casual conversation. As you listen, actively listen for at least 3 reduced or connected forms we discussed today, things like gonna, wanna, gotta, or linking sounds between words. Write them down, or just notice them mentally if you're on the move. Then, try repeating the sentence out loud yourself, copying the natural rhythm and reduction, even if it feels a little strange or unfamiliar at first. This tiny 5-minute exercise, repeated daily, builds real, lasting listening skill far more effectively than passively watching hours of content without any active engagement. I also want to address something many learners worry about: the fear of sounding wrong or lazy if they themselves start using these reduced, connected forms in their own speech. Here's an honest, balanced answer to that concern. In formal writing, job applications, academic essays, professional emails, you'll absolutely want to use full, clear forms, going to, rather than gonna, for example. But in casual spoken conversation, using natural reductions actually makes you sound more fluent, more comfortable, more like a confident, natural speaker, not less correct. Native speakers themselves use these forms constantly in casual talk, so learning to use them yourself, in the right casual contexts, is a genuinely valuable fluency skill, not a shortcut or a mistake. The real skill is knowing when each style fits, formal and careful in professional writing, relaxed and natural in casual conversation, and that flexibility itself is a sign of strong, mature language ability, not weakness. Let's talk for a moment about accents too, because this is another layer of complexity that often confuses and frustrates B1 learners specifically. English is spoken with an enormous range of accents around the world: American, British, Australian, Irish, Scottish, Canadian, South African, Indian, Nigerian, and countless regional variations within each of those broad categories. If you've mainly studied one particular accent, let's say a fairly neutral American accent from textbook audio, encountering a strong Scottish accent or a fast Australian accent for the first time can feel like starting from zero all over again, even though your underlying English skill hasn't actually decreased at all. This is completely normal, and honestly, it happens to native speakers too when they encounter unfamiliar accents from other English-speaking regions. My honest, practical advice here is this: don't try to master every accent at once, and definitely don't feel discouraged if a new accent temporarily confuses you. Instead, once you've built solid comprehension with one accent, gradually introduce exposure to others, a little at a time, the same gradual, comfortable challenge approach we talked about earlier. Your brain is remarkably adaptable, and with consistent, varied exposure over time, you'll find that understanding new accents becomes progressively easier because many of the underlying patterns, connected speech, reduction, stress timing, remain fairly similar across accents, even when specific sounds and vocabulary differ. Let's talk about one more incredibly valuable listening resource that often gets overlooked: background, ambient listening. This means playing English audio in the background while you're doing other things: cooking, cleaning, commuting, exercising, not as your main focused practice, but as supplementary exposure that keeps your ears warmed up and familiar with the sound and rhythm of English throughout your day. While this passive exposure alone won't replace focused, active practice, like the shadowing method we discussed earlier, it genuinely helps in a supporting role, keeping English rhythm and sound patterns present and familiar in your mind, almost like background music that quietly trains your ear even when you're not fully concentrating on it. I also want to mention journaling your listening progress because this small habit genuinely makes a noticeable difference over time. And it's something both Marco and Sophia mentioned finding helpful in their own journeys. After each focused listening practice session, jot down just one or two things, one phrase, or reduced form you learned or noticed for the first time, and one small win. A moment where you understood something you probably wouldn't have understood a month ago. Over weeks and months, looking back at this simple journal becomes incredibly motivating. Because progress in listening skill often feels invisible day to day, but genuinely visible over longer stretches of time. And having concrete written proof of your growth helps combat the discouragement that naturally creeps in during difficult practice sessions. Now, let's talk briefly about common mistakes learners make specifically when trying to improve their listening skills, because avoiding these pitfalls can save you significant time and frustration. The first common mistake is choosing content that's far too difficult, too fast, too advanced vocabulary, too unfamiliar accent, all at once. This leads to overwhelming frustration and often causes learners to give up on listening practice altogether, concluding incorrectly that they're simply bad at listening, when really, they just chose material outside their current comfortable challenge zone. The second common mistake is passive-only listening, playing content in the background without ever actively engaging, pausing, repeating, checking comprehension, which, while somewhat helpful as supplementary exposure, isn't sufficient on its own to build strong active comprehension skills. The third mistake is avoiding listening practice altogether out of fear or embarrassment, sticking only to reading and writing practice, which, understandable as that avoidance is emotionally, ultimately prevents the specific skill of listening from ever developing, because listening skill, like any skill, only improves through actual listening practice, not through avoidance. The fourth common mistake, and this one surprises many learners, is expecting comprehension to improve in a smooth, steady, predictable line. In reality, listening skill development tends to feel more like a staircase than a smooth ramp. Periods of feeling stuck, frustrated, like nothing is improving, followed by sudden, noticeable jumps in comprehension. Almost overnight, it seems, though really, it's the cumulative result of all that stuck feeling practice finally clicking into place. Understanding this pattern in advance helps you push through those frustrating plateau periods with patience, instead of giving up right before a breakthrough, which, honestly, happens to learners more often than you'd think, giving up just before things were about to click. Let's take a moment now to talk about listening comprehension specifically in different real-world contexts, because understanding native speakers in a movie is genuinely a different skill from understanding native speakers in a live, real-time conversation. And both are different again from understanding native speakers on the phone. In movies and shows, you often have visual context, facial expressions, body language, background scenes, which support your comprehension significantly, even when the audio itself is fast or unclear. In live conversation, you have the added benefit of being able to ask for clarification. Sorry, could you repeat that? Or, what do you mean by that? Which is a genuinely valuable, completely normal tool that even native speakers use constantly with each other, not just something learners need. On the phone, As we discussed with Sophia's story, you lose visual context entirely, which makes it the most challenging listening context for many learners. And honestly, that's worth knowing so you don't judge your overall listening skill too harshly based specifically on phone call difficulty, since it's a genuinely harder skill even for many native speakers in a second language. I want to specifically encourage you, if asking for clarification feels embarrassing or difficult, to reframe how you think about it completely. Native speakers ask each other to repeat things constantly, in noisy restaurants, over bad phone connections, when they're distracted, when an unfamiliar word comes up. Asking for clarification isn't a sign of weak English skill. It's a completely normal, healthy communication tool that skilled communicators use regularly, in every language, at every level. Learning a few natural, casual phrases for this can genuinely reduce your listening anxiety significantly. Try phrases like, "Sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you say it again?" Or, "Could you say that a bit slower, please?" Or even just, "Sorry, what was that?" These phrases are natural, polite, completely normal, and using them confidently, rather than nodding along pretending to understand when you don't, genuinely improves your real communication far more than silently struggling ever could. Let's talk now about building a consistent, sustainable listening practice routine. Because information without a plan tends to fade quickly, and I really want this episode to lead to lasting change for you, not just a temporarily interesting listen. I'd suggest starting with just 10 to 15 minutes of focused, active listening practice daily, using the method we outlined earlier. Listen fully. Listen again with pausing and guessing. Check comprehension. Shadow the tricky parts. Revisit after a day or two. Pair this with some relaxed, lower-pressure listening exposure throughout your day, a podcast during your commute, a show during dinner, background audio while doing chores, not as your main practice, but as supportive, ongoing exposure. Once a week, perhaps, challenge yourself with something slightly harder than your comfortable level. A faster podcast, a stronger accent, a livelier group conversation clip, just to keep gently stretching your skill forward, while returning to comfortable level material the rest of the week to build confidence and consolidate what you're learning. Consistency, genuinely, matters far more than intensity here. 15 focused minutes daily will take you significantly further over a few months than a single overwhelming 3-hour listening marathon once a month, both because of how memory and skill consolidation actually work in our brains, benefiting enormously from spaced, repeated practice rather than occasional cramming, and because daily practice keeps your motivation and momentum alive, rather than letting long gaps between sessions cause you to forget progress and lose confidence in between. Before we wrap up today's episode, I want to circle back one more time to Marco and Sophia, because I think their stories deserve a proper, satisfying ending, the way good stories should. Marco, about a year after that first coffee shop moment, told me he genuinely forgot, most days, that English wasn't his first language, at least during casual conversations with friends and co-workers. Not because his accent disappeared. It didn't, and that's completely fine. Having an accent is not a flaw. It's simply part of who you are and where you come from. But because the constant internal struggle, the frantic translating, the panic, the feeling of being left behind in conversation had genuinely faded into something calm, natural, almost automatic. Sophia, similarly, eventually became the person on her team who handled phone calls confidently, the very thing that once terrified her most, becoming, over time, something she barely thought twice about. I share their full journeys with you today because I want you to genuinely believe, not just intellectually understand, but actually believe, deep down, that this same transformation is available to you too, regardless of where you're starting from right now. Maybe you're just beginning your B1 listening journey, feeling completely overwhelmed by fast native speech. Maybe you're already partway through, noticing small improvements, but still feeling frustrated by how far you have to go. Wherever you are, the path forward looks remarkably similar: consistent, active, curious practice, choosing material that's challenging but not overwhelming, being patient and kind with yourself through the inevitable plateaus, and trusting that small daily efforts genuinely compound into real, lasting skill over time, exactly the way they did for Marco, for Sophia, and for thousands of other learners just like you who've walked this exact path before. So here's what I want you to do. Right now, today, not next week, not when I have more time, but today. Choose one short piece of native English audio, something casual, something conversational, 30 seconds to 2 minutes long. Listen to it using the method we walked through together. Full listen, guess and pause, listen, comprehension check, shadowing practice, and a fresh listen tomorrow. That's it. That's your homework. And honestly, it takes less time than scrolling through social media for a few minutes. But the long-term payoff is genuinely, significantly greater. And hey, if you found today's episode helpful, genuinely helpful, not just pleasant background noise, I'd love for you to do a few small things that make a real difference for this show. Hit subscribe so you don't miss future episodes where we'll keep breaking down real, practical English skills exactly like this. Leave a comment below and tell me, honestly, what's the hardest part of listening to native speakers for you right now? Is it speed, accents, phrasal verbs, phone calls? I read these comments, genuinely, and they help me choose topics for future episodes that actually match what you're struggling with. And if you know someone else on their own English learning journey, a friend, a classmate, a coworker, share this episode with them. Learning alongside someone else, encouraging each other, checking in on each other's progress, makes this whole process significantly more enjoyable and significantly more sustainable over the long run. Before I let you go today, I want to leave you with one final thought. Every single fluent English speaker you've ever admired, in movies, in podcasts, in your own life, was once exactly where you are right now, confused by fast speech, overwhelmed by reductions and idioms, frustrated by how much faster real conversation moved compared to their textbook. They didn't get there through some secret shortcut or special natural talent. They got there through patient, consistent, curious practice, exactly like what we've talked about today. You're already doing that right now by showing up, by listening to this episode, by caring enough about your own growth to spend this time with me today. That matters more than you probably realize. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today on English in Fluency. I'm Alex, and I'll be right here next time, ready to help you take another confident step forward in your English journey. Until then, keep listening, keep practicing, keep being patient and kind with yourself. And I promise, the words that feel like a blur today We'll feel like old friends before you know it. Take care, and I'll talk to you very soon.